Okay, I think we will get started here as we join up together and get my compatriots on here. Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join up with us this evening as we are nearing the end, seventh inning stretch of this god-awful mess of the pandemic. It's been quite a ride, as I'm sure everyone is aware. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. I know many of you have been at least on our physical tours, if not on our virtual tours. Just a little quick background. We've been doing virtual literary pub crawls in Greenwich Village, Times Square, and Brooklyn for a little over 20 some odd years until the pandemic hit. And then we kind of pivoted to do virtual, which ironically was something we were exploring anyways. And we've been doing a handful of these, and it's something that we're looking to expand, and probably something we will continue even when we're able to get back in person again, because there's a nice thing about the virtual, which is A, the commute is great. B, you don't have to worry about driving home from the bar. But more importantly, it allows us the ability to expand our theme and our topic. Whereas in our walking tours, our educational tours, or our pub crawls, we're kind of limited to how far somebody can walk, how long somebody can talk, and what we can fit into in 3 bars in 3 hours. So with virtual, we're really not limited by geography. And that's a real benefit for us. We can explore some more people. We can get into some folks, even if they went to a bar or not. And we're really enjoying the fact that it's expanding our knowledge base. We appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us. We are traditionally a pub crawl. We're not really doing a pub crawl today, but for those of you at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, who, at least in the United States, who opted to have a drink, I did want to raise a glass and say thank you. We're going to get through this. We're close, and we're going to get through this. And I'm really glad that you're spending the end of this time with us, and I can't wait to raise a glass with you in person. But in the meantime, I'd love to share a toast by the lovely Dorothy Parker, who once said, "I love to have a martini, 2 at the very most, 3 and I'm under the table, 4 and I'm under the host." Cheers to that. So we are today. We with our virtual tours, we're able to kind of expand on some of the themes, and so we're focusing on some of the ladies who lit, as we called it, some of the women writers of New York City, and as we were kind of figuring out how to theme all of this together, because there's too many writers that we could talk about in this topic, too many, far too many. We opted to geographically for Manhattan go north to south. We figured that way we could at least shrink it down a little bit. And then we just threw a dart into a neighborhood, and wherever it landed, we picked a writer who lived close to that dart, and we started talking about them, which is not entirely true. But what we wanted to do is beyond just talking about famous writers that everybody knows about, or everybody should know about, or many people are familiar with, we also wanted to mix in some folks that you may not have heard of or may not know as much detail. So hopefully we'll expose you to a few other interesting writers of different time periods. And since we're going to start at the top of Manhattan, we figured we'd top with a neighborhood whose name probably evokes more emotional response and has more imagery connected to it than almost any other neighborhood in the city. And that neighborhood is, of course, Harlem.
All right. So yes, we are.
Oh, and I want to say, I'm so sorry to interrupt you already. Oh, and that's a women's story.
Oh, and then you're going to mansplain and you're going to do the whole thing, aren't you, Eric?
I forgot to introduce you.
Yeah, you did.
Going through my notes here, it's so funny how much more nervous I get on a pub crawl here. I get obsessed with seeing the number of participants uptick and downtick rather than.
It's a problem when we get less drinks in us because we're not able to go to quite so many bars. We're really on top of our game when we've got like an average of 3 beers in us. So it's hard.
I wanted to call out. So at least in my layout, right above me is Rose Merritt, who has recently come on to kind of give us some background support on our tours and just some of our logistics. And we've been taking the pandemic to really kind of revitalize the internal, which desperately needed it. Whether or not you notice the difference, I have noticed a huge difference already in our company and our organizations and our tours with Rose being here. In fact, for the first time, I'm not running the PowerPoint. I'll have both hands free, and this will be Rose's first time doing it. So, I hope you will.
We have a feeling it'll be entirely more competent because.
Yeah. And then, of course, the sarcasm that is below me in my layout, the lovely Marissa Levine, who is a writer. She's worked in many bookshops. She actually really helped sculpt a lot of our Brooklyn tour together. She is an upcoming author. and she'll have a book coming out pretty soon. Oh, there it is right there. A sci-fi speculative fiction, which we were very excited to see. But she's been a guide with us for a very, very long time, and we're thrilled to have her both here. I promise to limit the number of times I interrupt her, and if I can keep it below the number of times she interrupts me, then I'll feel like it's a win. But now that I have introduced you, and now that we see this fun little map of Harlem, Marissa, would you please tell us a little bit about this neighborhood?
All righty, let's go. So we begin at the top being, well, not really the top, because the top would be Washington Heights, but Harlem. We begin in Harlem. Harlem is a fantastic neighborhood even now, but it's also got quite a storied history, as I'm sure a lot of you guys know. Harlem first took its place as sort of a cultural landmark in the 19-teens and 20s. It's sort of then that New York City saw this large influx of Black citizens as they migrated north to escape poverty and persecution in the Jim Crow South. Facing rejection in most New York neighborhoods, most Black Americans at that time, if they were moving to New York, they did end up in Harlem. From there, the Harlem Renaissance really blossomed. The only natural thing that really happens in a situation like that, when you cram a bunch of artists and revolutionaries and cultural figures all into one single Manhattan neighborhood, you had so much stuff going on in Harlem at this time. You had art movements from the likes of Jacob Lawrence. You had jazz greats like Duke Ellington and Bessie Smith and Cab Calloway. You know, a huge number of writers, some of the big names being Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and Jesse Redmond Fawcett. And then, of course, you had W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey leading all sorts of social and political revolutions. And my personal favorite, you even had Stephanie St. Clair revolutionizing organized crime and sticking it to fellow baddie, white guy, Dutch Schultz. She's my personal hero. Harlem has since gone through quite a few ups and downs, both culturally and economically, but there has always been a huge artistic output from this community, and that will hopefully continue today, tomorrow, forever. Now Harlem does face threats from gentrification, skin tones are unfortunately lightening, culture is homogenizing a bit, and we do live under the constant threat of the rote hipster brunch spot. There are a lot of folks out there, however, really trying to make sure that Harlem truly does stay Harlem.
And that last one, bounce, bounce, boom, there we go. And here's, of course, a shot of the Schoenberg Center here. Now, one of the first authors we want to talk about is somebody that I discovered at random. And she really kind of captured a lot of that 1940s era when we were really heavily into the Jim Crow. And that's Ann Petrie. Ann Petrie's first novel, as you can see here, but I love this book jacket. The Street is set in Harlem in World War II, and I gotta warn you in advance. So I have an affinity for book jackets. I guess if you run a book, like I love book covers, and especially these right here. This period that pulp classics of like the 60s and 80s, and especially like when you get to the sci-fi or the romance, I mean, they get a lot of fun. It's also interesting though to see how books get characterized throughout time, and it's something it's actually been a little bit of a bone to pick that I've had even with some other writers, some Detroit writers I was looking at, is how often Black literature gets kind of put into a pulp section and gets sort of sensationalized in a way that these covers, while interesting and unique, don't evoke great literature. And the literature is great. And this particular book of The Street is wonderful. Although I have to say it is emotionally challenging. It follows a woman named Ludy Johnson, who has an 8-year-old son. She's now a single mother because she's been fleeing her husband, who is semi-abusive, lost his job, and basically cheating on all sides of her. So she ends up moving into an apartment on 116th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue. And much of the book is set on that one particular block. And it's really about how she's struggling to raise her son, despite the fact of being a single woman in the 40s, being a Black single woman in the 40s, being a poor Black single woman in the 40s. And when you know, we're dealing with a lot of the jobs that either were going to the white women during the war or going back to the soldiers who were returning. And so she really had all of the cards laid against her. And it's a bit of a tragic novel about how the street just kind of consumes her. there's one quote that I like. I mean, there's so many that could come from there, but she writes about riding the subway from work in Manhattan back up to Harlem. And she writes, as the train gathered speed for the long run to 125th Street, the passengers settled down into small private worlds, thus creating the illusion of space between them and their fellow passengers. The worlds were built up behind newspapers and magazines, behind closed eyes, or while staring at the varicolored show cards that bordered the coaches. Ludy Johnson tightened her clutch on an overhead strap, her tall, long-legged body swaying back and forth as the train rocked forward towards its destination. Like some of the other passengers, she was staring at the advertisement directly in front of her, and as she stared at it, she became absorbed in her own thoughts, so that she, too, entered a small private world which shut out the people tightly packed around her. And what I like about that is just about anyone who's ridden a subway for about the 70 years until now knows that feeling exactly. And we've replaced the newspapers with phones, but at the same time, that trying to find a little private space anywhere in Manhattan. The book is published in 1946, and it's set in the 1940s, so it's very vibrant and very alive, even as you're reading it. I mean, she was there seeing it. To give you some context, 1940s, when this book is set, is still, like I said, very heavily Jim Crow. Rosa Parks had yet to give up her seat on the bus. That happened in 1955, 9 years after this book gets published, and about 10 or 12 years after it's set. What's also interesting to me is that Ann Petrie had a very different lifestyle than many of the people she was writing about. She grew up in Connecticut as fairly middle class, or as middle class as a Black family could be in Connecticut, New England town, which has a notoriously very white neighborhood. She actually graduated from Connecticut Community College studying pharmacy, and she was a pharmacist at her parents' drugstore for a few years. And she did comment at one point, she said that there were opportunities and ambitions that were granted to her that were not granted to many of those who were of her same age living in more urban areas that were Black Americans. But that's not to say that she didn't face quite a bit of racism up in that area. She describes one time of being violently kicked off a beach because a white man didn't want a Black woman on the beach. She talks about having teachers who didn't want to teach her and thought it was a waste of time to teach her people how to write. But she also had an English teacher who was very supportive of her and actually encouraged her and said, I think you have what it takes to be a novelist. And that alone was the inspiration to really take her to where we are today. She moved to New York at age 30 after she had gotten married. And she was working on an after-school program on 116th Street, fairly close to between 7th and 8th Avenue. So she was really writing about the people she was seeing. She was writing about the world that was right there. And the effect of seeing firsthand just the poverty and the conditions of so many Black Americans her age, so many Black children were living in, it was extremely profound. In fact, her daughter Liz said her way of dealing with the problem was to write this book, which was maybe something that people who had grown up in Harlem weren't able to do. She was also contributing to numerous literary magazines. One in particular is called The Crisis, which is the longest running Black-focused publication, I think, in the world. Its first issue was in 1910, and it was started by W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP, which had founded just a year earlier. And this was down in Vesey Street for a while, and they moved to the Village, and then their offices moved around several locations. But The Crisis was a real powerhouse, was and still is a powerhouse literary magazine. A lot of writers of this time period were contributing to it. But the street has been heralded as probably one of the most evocative and empathic depictions of World War II era Harlem. And it's interesting to me because World War II America is often something that is nostalgicized. I'm not sure if that's a word, but I like it, nostalgicized. And it was America saving the world, coming together, victory gardens, fighting off fascism, innovative, just this real American go-get-it spirit. And yet Ann Petrie's novel, The Street, offers a very strong counterpoint to what that experience was for those with darker skin tones.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, and now
very much so.
Yeah.
No, yeah, just very much so. I'm gonna pivot us away from Ann Petrie, who is a truly incredible writer, and Eric is right. It's an emotionally heavy book, but it's one that's well worth your time. To another writer that is a particular favorite of mine. While Ann Petrie is this writer that I think for a lot of us is really in danger of being forgotten, and I sincerely hope that we've helped to fix this a little bit here today. Zorniel Hurston, the author of Their Eyes Were Watching God, is a writer whose fame really has grown exponentially in the decade.
I have to say, oh my goodness, Lucy Hurston is on who is the niece of Zorniel Hurston. This was not planned. Oh, this is so cool.
All right, well, I'm gonna hope that I can do your aunt justice. She's incredible and I like her a lot.
Fact checking just got significantly severe. I'm getting onto Google right now.
Surprise! Yes, Lucy, this is a surprise.
Okay, Marissa, deep breath.
Cracking my knuckles, ready to go. We got this. All right. So like I said, Zorniel Hurston, the author of Their Eyes Were Watching God and also a number of other amazing novels, is a writer whose fame has grown exponentially in the decades that have passed. Their Eyes Were Watching God is an incredibly modern book with a heroine who is subtle and complicated and flawed, and who very much resists the label of sort of nobility or victimhood, something that was very common for Black characters at this time, especially Black female characters. And ironically, unfortunately, in her own lifetime, this led to her work not being taken seriously by critics at the time of publication, both in Black and white circles. Her work really wasn't recognized as much as it should have been in its own time. And in fact, Hurston ended up dying in obscurity, and her body was buried in an unmarked grave in Florida, in Eatonville. Alice Walker, fast forward to the 1970s, Alice Walker championed her as one of her main literary influences. For those of you that might not know, Alice Walker is the writer of The Color Purple, amongst many other amazing novels. And she really credits Hurston as one of her main literary giants that she looked up to, and she really helped to bring her back into the limelight. There's an argument to be made, I think, that without Zorniel Hurston, you really would not have modern Black female authors like Alice Walker or even Toni Morrison. They very much follow in the footsteps of Zorniel Hurston. In 1974, Alice Walker took up a search for Zorniel Hurston's grave and wrote about it for Miss Magazine. She actually flew down to Eatonville, Florida, and Lucy, you may know this, pretended to be Zorniel Hurston's niece in order to gain access to the information that she needed to find the body.
That's so perfect.
So while the near erasure of her is tragic, and I'm so very grateful. Yep, she played me. I'm incredibly grateful to Alice Walker for the work that she did to really bring back Zorniel Hurston into the limelight. And now, of course, she's taught in high school classrooms, she's taught everywhere, and she's a really big part of everything. I wanted to start with her death and then basically flip-flop it to talk about her life in Harlem a little bit, because I just didn't want to end on a downer. I think Zorniel Hurston doesn't deserve ending on a downer like an unmarked grave. So as interesting and fascinating as Alice Walker's saga was, I want to rewind a little bit and go back to Hurston showing up in Harlem. So Zorniel Hurston first showed up in Harlem in 1925. She was coming up from the American South. She was chasing that cultural movement that she'd heard so much about. She was 34, but she told everyone that she was 24. She had $1.50 in her purse, one published short story to her name, and as she said it, she had no job, no friends, but a lot of hope. By her biographer's own admission, Zorniel Hurston actually didn't do her most consequential writing while living in Harlem. She mostly hung out. She went to a lot of parties and she wrote the occasional play or a short story. Despite this, she is still seen as one of the major literary fixtures of the Harlem Renaissance. She was enrolled as the first Black student at Barnard at the time. She was living at 131st Street, just a few blocks down from a rooming house where artists could live for free. And that included such artists as Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks, Countee Cullen, the list goes on and on and on. And of course, Hurston rubbed elbows with all of them. Though she didn't do a ton of her major writing while living in Harlem, she does credit her time in Harlem with shaping her as a writer. It was for the first time for her, she was able to encounter Black pride. And it's arguably the first time in America when Black artists were being viewed as legitimate. So to give you one last wonderful image of Zorniel Hurston in Harlem, this is what she liked to say about strolling down the street. She said that she liked to set her at a certain angle and saunter down 7th Avenue, Harlem City, feeling as snooty as the lions in front of the 42nd Street Library.
Nice. And of course, the 42nd Street Library kind of brings up into our second area that we wanted to focus on, which is sort of the Midtown area. Just found this map today on a site that has all sorts of weird, quirky maps of the 1890s. But you know, Midtown, what I like about Midtown is it's such a vague delineation for a neighborhood that we can kind of call almost anything we want. South of Harlem, north of 14th Street is Midtown if we really wanted to. Some residents might bicker at me about that a little bit, but you know, there's just so many neighborhoods that are kind of in that area, whether it's the Garment District, the Diamond District, the Flatiron District, the Flatiron, my main accent coming out there. I love this shot that we found here. But and I also love how like real estate speculators love to change neighborhoods in a way to try to increase rents and popularity. They were doing that for Hell's Kitchen for a while. I don't remember they were trying to call it. I'm blanking now. What were they trying to call Hell's Kitchen for a while? It was not Clinton Hill. I got it. It's gonna come back to me in a second. But they, you know,
no,
I don't remember now. But they, you know, they're always sort of changing names and making smaller neighborhoods a new name to make it trendy to kind of rent it out. But predominantly, a lot of what we like to talk about in the Midtown area is kind of that Times Square area, that 42nd Street, Bryant Park. You had Times Square was originally Longacre Square, as it was known. I say originally after the Dutch and the British were kind of living in that area. Clinton, thank you, Clinton. Ellen O'Brien with the win. Clinton is what.
Oh, yes, I do remember this.
Yeah,
Clinton. Yes.
It kind of came and went, and I'm glad it.
Very vague. Yeah.
But the Longacre Square was what the Dutch were calling it. They named after. It's the English were calling it because that's Longacre Square in England, where some horses and carriages were being built, and apparently in this area that was similar. But I do want to call out that is not the original name. The original name by the natives would have been much different, but that is what the colonists began calling that area until it eventually became Times Square. And it would become a place for a center of literature, Broadway, hotels. There was a place for the glamorous mob-run speakeasy clubs that would become simply the glamorous mob-run clubs. Actually, if you want to go back for a second, that's the original Times Square, which is the reason why the neighborhood got the building. It got its name. The New York Times was changing locations, built that building there, and so they started pushing hard to change the name of Longacre Square to Times Square, but all the other newspapers in the area didn't like that. They didn't want to call their neighborhood after their competitor's newspaper. Eventually, obviously, Times Square won. And then, yeah, if you want to advance to that 1940s, this isn't really showing some of the glamorous speakeasy clubs, nor is it showing what would eventually become the mob-run sex clubs that lacked a little bit of that glamour. But now it's a place for Disney and Marvel and Elmo to hand out flyers. But you had a lot of clubs during Prohibition and just after, like the 300 Club, the Alfay, the 21 Club, Club in Time, Studio 54, the Copacabana. You also had a lot of hotels that were really popular, both for hanging out and for staying in. The bars were popular, places like the Algonquin, the Astor Hotel, the Plaza, the Waldorf Astoria, the Warwick. These were all central to the literary and cultural movements of their time. And a lot of this is really celebrating and creating what I refer to as sort of as the mystique of New York. There's something about New York when people think about it, if I'm to make a gross generalization of the 7 billion people on the planet, oftentimes in the back of their head, they're kind of thinking about that Prohibition, post-Prohibition years of New York, when it was all Broadways and the neon lights and the sort of glamorous, sexy mobsters. Frank Sinatra was a big reason for that, hanging out with them. And there's something about that time period that is, again, romanticized, that World War II era. that is very romanticized about New York. And there's something about that mystique that I think so much of what we are capitalizing on comes from that time culturally. And it comes from some of the writers that were there at that time. One of the hotels that were recently learned about was the Barbazon Hotel, which it was a residential. It's a residential building now. This is when it was the all women's hotel that was built in 1927. Now it's called Barbazon 63. And it's a little bit more residential, but it's landmarked at least. But it was built as an all-women's hotel with the goal of keeping them safe, keeping them ladylike, and helping inspire their arts and creation. They quickly became a place, an entry for young, white, pretty, middle, upper-class young ladies. It was a very particular style. They were bragging about how they were creating the modern woman. Men were not allowed past the lobby. I actually even read one quote that maybe J.D. Salinger was known to hang out at the lobby a little bit while he was on his single days. But the hotel required very strict recommendations to get in there. I think robust was the word I described. They also did a visual inspection to ensure that the appearance and the manners were properly ladylike. The hotel was very restricted to the ladies, but it was also meant to inspire them. And Sylvia Plath really delved into that in her novel, The Bell Jar. She calls the hotel the Amazon there, but she really deals with the dichotomy of just how restrictive of a refined place is supposed to inspire creativity, which usually needs a bit more of a relaxed, freeing atmosphere. It was a kicking off place for Grace Kelly, Joan Didion, Liza Minnelli, Plath, obviously, Elaine Stritch, Sybil Shepherd, Felicia Rashad, and the unsinkable Molly Brown, the woman who survived several shipwrecks, one being, of course, the Titanic. Now, some of this is coming from a recent book here, The Barbazon by Paulina Bren, which just came out, which is why there's only one book jacket in our slide. But if you are interested in learning more about it, this is a wonderful resource, and I'm sure Paulina would really appreciate the business and the attention.
I've rifled through it. It's quite a good book. If we're going to be talking about notable literary hotels, though, I think we would also be absolute failures if we didn't also happen to mention the Algonquin Hotel, which was the site of the famous Algonquin Round Table. The Round Table, for those that might not be familiar, was a regular lunchtime gathering of famously witty writers, which started shortly after the First World War when Alexander Wolcott came back from journalism duty. That's the classic Al Hirschfeld sketch of all of them. The most famous face of the Round Table was Dorothy Parker, our beloved queen of the acid tongue and the poison pen. But in this quick 45 minutes, I actually want to highlight another Round Table compatriot who I personally think was equally witty and criminally forgotten, the fantastic playwright and novelist, Edna Ferber. So Edna Ferber is somebody that you haven't heard of, but you've heard of her contributions to culture oh so much. She won a Pulitzer for her novel So Big. Without her, this is my personal favorite, we would not have the song Old Man River. Her novel Showboat was made into the celebrated musical. So what would all of the baritones do if Edna Ferber had not written this particular book? A huge portion of her works were made into films, the big one being Giant, which starred James Dean, dreamy, dreamy James Dean, Rock Hudson, also quite dreamy, and Elizabeth Taylor. There's some pretty iconic movie posters from that one. I feel like I had a poster of James Dean from Giant on my bedroom wall as a high school student. Ferber actually underwent sort of a reversed ghostwriting charge. I think it's pretty well known that female writers have often over the years, up until today, have often gone under male pseudonyms or pen names when they're writing their master opuses, because otherwise there's a chance that they won't be taken too seriously if people find out that it was written by a woman. But Edna Ferber got the reverse. She, at one point in 1912, had a collection of her short stories published, and it became a widely circulated rumor, oft bandied about in the newspapers, that the collection was actually written by a man under a woman's name because the short stories were so good. How could they possibly have been written by a woman? Nobody pointed out that this is absolutely inane and made no sense, since women have been writing under male pseudonyms since time immemorial in order to be taken seriously. Regardless, Ferber took great pride in the rumor, since she preferred her merits to be judged without consideration to her sex. Ferber never married, and she had no known love affairs. This, by the way, did not seem to bother her at all. There is a quote from one of her earlier novels that really sums up, people often think, what her sort of life motto was on the subject. She said, "Being an old maid was a great deal like death by drowning, a really delightful sensation when you ceased struggling." There were a lot of rumors because of her lack of male suitors. There were a lot of rumors that she was a lesbian due to her perpetual singleness. History has really never proved this one way or the other, but men always still found ways to judge her nonetheless, and she was always ready to skewer them if they tried. Once, when a gentleman joked that her suit made her resemble a man, she snapped back, "So does yours."
I love that quote.
She frequently collaborated with a number of her roundtable buddies, but her genuine favorite was probably the celebrated playwright George Kaufman. She loved him quite a lot. They worked together a lot on various plays, but she also did hold a lifetime animosity towards another roundtabler, that would be Alexander Wolcott. Alexander Wolcott apparently gave a nasty review to one of her first plays. In response to his critiques, she said, "It is just that degree of malignant poisoning that I have always found so stimulating in the works of Mr. Wolcott." She wrote about the Round Table in her memoirs, and it's really hard to find insiders' points of view when it comes to this really fascinating group of writers. So I thought I'd leave off on her by her describing what the Round Table really meant to her and what these people in her mind were really like. She said, "I never have encountered a more hard-bitten crew, but if they liked what you had done, they did say so, publicly and wholeheartedly. Their standards were high, their vocabulary fluent, fresh, astringent, and very, very tough. Theirs was a tonic influence, one on the other and on the world of American letters. The people they could not and would not stand were the bores, hypocrites, sentimentalists, and the socially pretentious. They were ruthless towards charlatans, towards the pompous, and the mentally and artistically dishonest. Casual, incisive, they had a terrible integrity about their work and a boundless ambition."
I think I would have been eviscerated if I tried to sit down at that lunch.
Oh yeah, we would be sliced to bits.
But at least I used eviscerated, which was a good vocabulary, right? It's good vocabulary.
Excellent.
I also would like to note that, yes, I made a GIF.
Yes, you did. It was very good.
Or GIF. There's still an argument on what it's pronounced, but I've learned how to create them. Now, this is a favorite moment for me because we had this running joke for years, especially with our village tour, which was our flagship. Oh, thank you, Nicole. Nicole's proud of my GIF. Hard G, GIF is peanut butter. Oh gosh, I've opened up that can of peanut butter. So we had this running joke for the longest time that our tour was the death tour on the village, because everyone we were talking about was long deceased at that point. We changed that when we get to Brooklyn. We started talking about Jonathan Ames and L.J. Davis and a few others. But so many of the authors we were writing were dead. And in fact, what I realized after about, I say 8 or 9 years of really running the tour and focusing on the tour, I realized I hadn't read a living writer, and I didn't know how long. And part of it was well-intentioned, because if I'm talking about the writers, I would prefer to be reading them. I'm struggling with these virtual tours because once a month, it's hard to read 8 books in a month to keep up with some of these other writers. But like, I'd prefer to have read somebody that I'm talking about rather than just regurgitating what I see on Wikipedia. Not that we don't do that, but we regurgitate lots of other things too. I have all of these books that I regurgitate as well as Wikipedia. Anyways, Jennifer Egan, who I'm about to talk about now, I was very excited to be one of my living writers that I read. And it came from, I don't know how many of you are from New York, but a few years ago, New York was doing the subway campaign, something called like Everyone Read the Same Book, where they had 5 finalists and they were asking everyone to vote for it. And that was going to be the book that they were going to promote, with the goal of having everyone in the subway reading the same book. Egan's novel, Manhattan Beach, didn't win, but it was a wonderful read. And it for me, I really liked it because it's set partially in Brooklyn, where we have one of our tours, and it's set partially in Manhattan, where we have another one of our tours. And so there was a lot in there. And as you can see, yes, we have some book jackets here that we found. Now, I did notice there are some book jackets there are some titles that are similar to Manhattan Beach, so it's easy to get confused. So as we're scrolling, like, oh no, this is not Jennifer Egan. Put a big fat no on that, but here we go. Yeah, spin it around. That's the good Manhattan Beach. I found another book. No. Bring the no.
That looks like a Gossip Girl knockoff.
Yeah, more nose. Arena nose. Yes, get rid of that. I think that there we go. This is the one. Manhattan Beach. Jennifer Egan. It follows a young girl during World War II, a young lady, I should say, Anna, who is getting a job at the Brooklyn Navy Yards because obviously a lot of the men are out fighting in the war. And so she's working at a shipyard to help build ships. And there's a few jobs that she wants to get involved with, and particularly diving and working underneath the boats. And they won't let her because she's just a girl. And she kind of pushes beyond that. And Egan also, during this time, she's also writing about the fact that she's meeting sort of a popular, somewhat sexy gangster who's running a club that was successful during Prohibition, that he was continuing to run post-Prohibition. And she's kind of curious about this man because she thinks she remembers him connected to her father, who has disappeared when she was a child. And she's trying to figure out what happened to her father. So she's weaving all of these mysterious stories together, all while dealing with being a young woman at really what was some of the beginnings of the equal rights of the post-World War, and women really getting out to the work, and the whole Rosie pump your bicep moment that it was culturally very significant. Egan herself was born in Chicago. She moved to New York when she was 25, and like many struggling writers, she worked sort of in restaurants and also catering at the World Trade Center. She's written for The New Yorker, The New York Magazine. Her first novel, The Invisible Circus, was made into a movie, and her novel, The Goon Squad, won her the Pulitzer. But we often talk about how many writers helped shape that mystique of New York. And Egan here really capitalizes on that mystique and really helps bring it to life in a very modern way. She's, capturing that Broadway, the clubs, the nightlife, that Brooklyn Navy Yards, that working class vibe. And all of that really reached its peak culturally in the 1940s. So Egan captures that energy wonderfully in the novel Manhattan Beach. And we're really excited to see what Egan's next novel will have to bring to us. Oh, I still continue.
Yeah, you get to keep going.
The nice thing about being the boss is I get to talk. So if anyone captures the rebellious spirit of New York, I don't think anyone does quite as well as New York native Susan Sontag. She's a true icon of rebellion. She breathed rebellion. She emanated rebellion. And you can see that so clearly in this picture of her in a bear suit. Nothing screams rebellion like a bear suit. And I love that you can see that she's trying hard not to lose it in that picture. I think a lot of us in the theater world know that smirk when somebody does something uniquely funny and you're on stage and like, I can't laugh right now, but I want to. Early in her life, she was really focused on being a novel, and that was where she saw herself going, was being a writer, and she was pursuing that as a career. But it's really her essays and her speeches and her activism and journalism that really made her the powerhouse writer over numerous decades. She wrote on uncomfortable subjects like the AIDS pandemic, the human rights. She had strong anti-war sentiments, very liberal thought, which was not very popular through a lot of America, especially in the 80s and 90s. She wrote about Vietnam and the siege of Sarajevo, but she wasn't one to just kind of opinionate about these. Like, she went there, she needed to see it, and she needed to be a part of it. And so much so that she had gone to Sarajevo and she was so moved by it, she wanted to go back, and she needed a reason. So she decided to direct an entirely candlelit production of Waiting for Godot. And it's candlelit because this city had no power in this area for almost 3 years, I believe, was one place that I quoted. So she decided to use some candlelight. And she wrote about it saying, I went to Sarajevo in mid-July to stage a production of Waiting for Godot, not so much because I'd always wanted to direct Beckett's play, although I had, as because it gave me a practical reason to return to Sarajevo and stay for a month or more. I had spent 2 weeks there in April and had come to care intensely about that battered city and what it stands for. Some of its citizens had become friends, but I couldn't just be a witness. That is, meet and visit, tremble with fear, feel brave, feel depressed, have heartbreaking conversations, grow ever more indignant, and lose weight. If I went back, it would be to pitch in and do something. And it was a big hit and very well received, not just because of the performance, because of what it meant and what it meant that she was doing and the intention that she was bringing. And so much so that the mayor made her an honorary citizen and said, this is because of your bravery in coming here, living here, and working with us. And there's even a street named after her there. She married at 17, had a son. The marriage lasted only about 8 years, and then they split. And it was after that that she really kind of embraced her bisexuality and the more private conquest of who she really was. She met and fell in love with artist Maria Irene Fornes for a bit. And this was a perfect opportunity for her self-serving husband to drop a lawsuit for a custody battle, claiming that she was unfit to be a mother because of her lesbian tendencies. Now, he was notoriously self-serving, and the reality of this was less about him wanting full custody of his son, as more that he wanted her name stricken from the record of the book that they co-wrote together, Freud, The Mind of the Moralist. She had worked tirelessly on it. I think he may have put in more than his 50% of the share, but he wanted 100% of the credit. And so this custody battle and the agreement that came out of it was how he was able to get her name off of it so he could take all of the credit. That's what we refer to as a class act. But she did have some more humorist views of love and literature. She wrote an essay where she decided to divide authors into either husbands or lovers. Instead of, coming up with other dichotomies that were popular at the time, she wanted to come up with husbands and lovers. And so she started with Albert Camus, who she named the ideal husband of contemporary letters, but it wasn't really a compliment. She writes, "Some writers supply the solid virtues of a husband: reliability, intelligibility, generosity, decency. There are other writers in whom one prizes the gifts of a lover, the gifts of temperament, rather than of moral goodness. Notoriously, women tolerate qualities in a lover: moodiness, selfishness, unreliability, brutality, that they would never countenance in a husband, in return for the excitement and that infusion of intense feeling. In the same way, readers put up with unintelligibility, obsessiveness, painful truths, lies, and bad grammar, if, in compensation, the writer allows them to savor rare emotions in dangerous situations." But I think her best views on her romance comes from a quote that she had in an interview with The Guardian in 2000, where she said, "Shall I tell you about getting older?" And she's laughing. "When you get older, 45 plus, men stop fancying you. Or put it another way, the men I fancy don't fancy me. I want a young man. I love beauty. So what's new?" She says she has been loved several times in her life, but then she says, "No, hang on." She says, "Actually, it's 9. 5 women, 4 men."
Well, moving further south, if there is any part of town where you could fall in love with 5 women and 4 men, often in the span of a single night, it is definitely Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village, our bread and butter. The Village had to have also been a favorite of Sontag's at some point or another. The Village was home to various rounds of sexual revolution. In fact, similar to Harlem, though markedly more white, Greenwich Village has been home to a variety of cultural movements, with powerful female figures at the center of many of them. You had Jane Jacobs defending historical preservation and the fight against bulldozing of lower class neighborhoods in the name of, quote, slum clearance and urban renewal. Down with Robert Moses, down with him, I say. You had women's rights activist and anarchist Emma Goldman, who was jailed several times for inciting riots, distributing birth control, and plotting to assassinate the industrialist Henry Clay Frick. And then slightly less fun, you also had the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire of 1911, which led to a number of female activists, principal among them Rose Schneiderman, to demand unionization and better labor laws for women. If you haven't heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, it is a bit of a mouthful. It's one of the things that I can say and know that I'm not drunk yet. Here's the basics.
Set the bar high, Marissa. Set it high.
Yep. No, that's. I always have certain key phrases to know when I need to stop drinking cocktails, and that's one of them. It was a factory just east of Washington Square Park, as it is now. The workers were primarily young Jewish immigrant women, and the factory, as the name suggests, manufactured fabric, which is highly flammable. Managers preferred to keep the workers locked inside the factory so that they couldn't take unsupervised breaks and so that they could keep out any union organizers who might be trying to come in and distribute pamphlets, nudge them towards meetings, things like that. All of this, of course, meant that when a fire caught in a scrap bin one day, it turned into a complete tragedy. Very few workers were able to find a way to escape due to all the locked doors. 146 people died, and 123 of them were women, the youngest being only 14 years old. All of this did spur on the cause of Schneiderman and other female labor union activists, and it helped to set the first standards for New York City fire codes. So if you've got a fire escape in your building, say a small prayer of thanks to the dead. And I am also raising my glass now to the dead.
I will do the same for that.
Here's to Rose Schneiderman. Here's to anarchists like Emma Goldman and all the rest.
And John Sloan. Thank you, Ellen.
And John Sloan, indeed.
I don't know if you said this, but that was the biggest tragedy in New York City before 9/11.
Yeah.
But in 1925, a young 17-year-old girl arrived in Greenwich Village, New York. She arrived by Twain. By Twain. Yeah, it was a specialized literary humorist train. She only had $20 in her pocket, which I think, in 1925 is probably, I don't know, worth $50 now. But it was, it's more amazing when you consider that A, she'd never been on a train, B, she'd never been to New York City, C, she was running away from home, and D, she was deaf. Pauline Leader, pictured here both as an adult and as a teenager, probably right before she ran on the right. It was probably right before she ran away. She'd been living with her family in Vermont. It was a very strict Jewish family in a New England town. And she mentioned how she felt alienated right from the beginning. It was all exacerbated when she lost her hearing. She lost her hearing when she was about 14 years old due to complications of meningitis. And this alienation she felt in living in a small town just kind of took off. And in fact, one way she wrote one small poem as a young lady where she writes, "Small town, where is your horizon? Though I have climbed to the dome of the post office and peered from the clock tower of the jail, your highest buildings, I could not find it, and the lack of one suffocates me." She turned the page. She wrote a memoir. And Noberg Singh here, which is more recent. Well, it was in the 30s, but it's been recently republished. A Room for the Night has some collections of poems and writings of when she was younger, and her mother was running a boarding house at the time. But in Noberg Singh's really is her firsthand account, very personal and very sad, because the 1920s was not a good time to be a young deaf Jewish woman, especially coming from a very strict religious family. But she would talk about how when she lost her hearing, she kept referring it as it being stolen by a gnome. So throughout the book, she talks about the gnome who stole her hearing and her joy. There's one part in the book where she's talking about struggling in school, and she goes to a new school and she's lost, and she'd been latching on to the only girl her age who had been nice to her, who was apparently getting sick of it because she was deaf and she couldn't talk, and so everyone thought she was stupid. And she writes at one moment that, "I blundered into the strange classrooms. The instructor, annoyed, told me that I was in the wrong room. I am deaf, I repeated over and over again. I said something, words which had no relation to her words. The class roared with laughter. Didn't the teacher understand I couldn't hear? I am deaf, I repeated over and over again. Finally, some intelligence penetrated the teacher's head and she wrote down the words and I escaped. The cruelty and the curiosity of those who were my own age, laughing at me. Damn them." In Vermont, going through all of this, she starts reading the newspapers about this little neighborhood of Greenwich Village. And many of the writers that were there, including a Maxwell Bodenheim, who was sort of a notorious poet, eventually became a notorious bum, but was very sort of well-known and respected at the time. And they had a bit of a correspondence. And it was because of that correspondence that she eventually ran away to the village. And she found herself in that time in one of the, I guess, cultural hotspots of the time, sort of the unofficial ones, a place called Hubert's Cafe. And again, in her memoir, she writes, "I walked to a chair with my coffee and rolls and a check which had been punched at 10 cents. 10 cents for a coffee and roll. The loneliness that left me. Surely these were my kind of people. These were the poets, the writers, the artists, my own kind. I had stumbled by chance on their meeting place." Leader's life was never easy. She continued to that moment. The gnome had taken my hearing away 6 years and had permeated my whole being. I did not dare go speak to them. Not even in my dreams, the dreams of sleep, was I free of him. Not even in my dreams dared I accost people. That gnome was a monkey on her back that she never really got rid of. She was pretty much asexual, and I think part of it is because the way people treated her, and just that she found her mother's marriage to be miserable. She found a lot of marriage to be miserable, even though she was married for a while with poet Milton Brand. As a teenager, before really becoming published, she worked in sweatshops, hopefully under slightly better conditions than what we learned from the Shirtwaist factory.
We can only hope.
We could only hope. But it wasn't that much long after it. It was the 20s. But her spirit and independence was very strong. But the gnome always loomed over her, and she was constantly struggled with that self-doubt and that self-worth. But she found her solace in her writing. For a young deaf girl in New York, the city is no easy place. And here's a short poem that I think both captures the difficulties of being deaf in the city, but also just that strong strength and humor that she would evoke. And it's called Trucks. New York is a city of trucks. It is empty except for the trucks. The streets are made for them, policemen are made for them, and almost one day I was made for them. But the policeman caught my hand in time, and together, the policeman and I held each other's hand tightly, and together we tingled with triumph. We had outwitted a truck. Pauline Leader.
Pauline Leader, an incredible poet. I wanted to switch over to another poet who also ended up finding New York something of a hard place to be, some place that she found herself ostracized in, but kind of kept going nonetheless. And that would be the poet Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde is very well known in the Village, though some might be wondering whether or not we should put her in the Harlem portion of this, because she was a native of Harlem and she grew up in Harlem, though she also wrote pretty extensively about how she bristled under the societal constraints of Harlem as she was growing up. She was sort of a dynamo fairly early on in her life, a poet from birth, one might say. She published her first poem in 17 magazine while she was still in high school. And this was after that same poem got rejected from her own Hunter High School's literary journal because they thought that the poem was too controversial. She also tried to give Harlem another go by participating in classes at the Harlem Writers Guild, but confessed that she never really fit in there because, quote, I was both crazy and queer, and they thought I would grow out of it all. She didn't. Before settling down with her longtime partner, Frances Clayton, she did have quite a few fun single gal times in Greenwich Village, specifically at the lesbian bars, the Pony Stable Inn, which was formerly on West 4th Street, I think where the Washington Square Park Diner is now. Yeah. And the Bagatelle, which is on University Place, and now is the site of a pretty decent Mexican restaurant, if my days from NYU are to be believed. She described the Bagatelle as having a, quote, postage stamp size dance floor, but it got the job done. And she felt that she could be at least relatively more at ease in her own skin, at least as a queer woman, though being a Black woman in the Village was never easy. She said, it was hard enough to be Black and female, to be Black, female, and gay, to be Black, female, gay, and out of the closet in a white environment, even to the extent of dancing in the Bagatelle, was considered by many Black lesbians to be simply suicidal. It seems by her own admission that in Harlem, she couldn't fit in because of her queerness, and down in the Village, her race kept her ostracized. Her outsiderness did ultimately give her an edge, however. She was decades ahead of her time, and she saw things from a vantage point that was lost to most of the leaders of mainstream cultural movements of the day. This is what she had to say in one of her most famous political essays, an essay titled, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." She says, those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring out genuine change. Lorde was groundbreaking because she gave voice to so many who were left out of the social revolutions at the time. She spoke about homophobia within the civil rights movement. She called out first wave feminists on their hypocrisy for not including women of color. And she also called out gay culture for also excluding persons of color and not giving them proper support. And this was all in the 50s and 60s and 70s when this was insanely radical and personally dangerous as a stance to take. As much as I find her political essays incredibly moving, it would also be a crime if I didn't offer up one of her poems for you, because her poetry is truly, truly beautiful. And that is what she identified as first and foremost. This is from her poem, Litany for Survival. It's a poem about finding strength in adversity and virtues in fear. She writes, "When the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive."
I got to tell you, you're reading that poem, and I'm literally looking in her eyes in this picture, and there, and with what she's got on the chalkboard, and those, I mean, like I had chills listening to that, and just having her stare me down.
She's a powerful lady.
Yeah, powerhouse. And on that note, thank you. We really appreciate you taking the opportunity for us to at least hit on 7,000 writers that we could have probably talked about in this short period of time. But it really means a lot to have you take this time. I mean, we have a real passion for this, and we have an opportunity now to share that passion, despite the fact that we can't be in person. If you are like to follow us more, if you are not already, the triumvirate of social media, you can find us at our handle at Lit Pub Crawl. It's the same on all three of them there. If you want some more information, you can go to our website. And you can sign up to our mailing list if you're not already on it, to hear about some future tours. I promise you, A, we're not giving your information to nobody, and B, we're not going to email you that much. We're just going to let you know when we have another virtual tour and we have something going on. You can also go to our Patreon page. We are looking to expand and are looking for some supporters with that. We have a really exciting podcast that we're trying to put together of going beyond the book, where we're talking not just about an author and their history and the writer and their history, but what else was going on, putting it in context in the greater world. And so with that being said, I also want to do a quick plug, because again, in my layout down here is Marissa, who I mentioned she is going to be an author. We're going to send you a follow-up email. It's going to have all of the links that you that would need for those social medias, and a plug to pre-order her book, which I would encourage you to do, because eventually we're going to be doing a tour about her, and I'm going to capitalize on her success in every way that I can. But I know what bars she's gone to.
Yeah, you've got all the good blackmail material on me.
And I know what has been said. I also, if you are in a position, I know the pandemic has hit many of us hard. It kills us that we're not doing physical tours. Rose just posted some links. If you're in a position where you have not been financially hit and can share a little to tip the guides, certainly that would be appreciated. However, if you can't, we get it. It's a pandemic. We've all been hit hard, and we're in that 7th inning stretch. We are going to get through this. We are going to get through this. And I sincerely look forward to raising a glass with you again in one of these bars and sharing some stories in person. And I really appreciate that you took a little bit of this time with us. We are in this together. We're going to have a drink together. We're going to get through this. And we're going to keep doing these. So you don't always have to come to New York City, and we will continue to share these. But that being said, we have a little bit of time for questions for those who want to stick around. I know it's 8 o'clock right now, which is usually our ending point. But if anyone has any questions that they want to tag our way, feel free. And if not, we look forward to seeing you in our next one in March. Right? Did I say that? No, this is March. In April.
In April. Yes. April is the month that is coming up next.
We're on day 922 of year 2020.
Time is a flat circle, as it turns out.
So if you guys want to ask any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A bubble, the button there. You just click on that and you can leave a question. I have a question though, as you guys are thinking about things. Since we have or had Lucy Hurston on the line for a little bit, it seems prescient that I should ask something about Zorniel Hurston. So Zorniel Hurston was very involved in the Harlem Renaissance, a very notable figure, but not always, sometimes a kind of slightly divisive person in that community. And do you think you guys could speak to like what her reputation was in the Harlem?
Oh, did we all just freeze up? As far as I can tell, I'm the only person talking. So, there we go.
What's that?
There was everyone froze for a second. I was just talking to myself. My internet is unstable. Again, 400 megabytes per second here. Tell me my internet is unstable. 470 megabytes per second.
Good grief. Good grief. In any case, yeah. Everybody enjoyed her just as a friend and as a person, but she did notably like leave Harlem and go back to the South, go back to, I know that she died in Eatonville, Florida. She lived in a couple different places, I believe, but Eatonville, Florida was sort of her main home. By the time that Their Eyes Were Watching God was published, she was living in the South, and she still visited Harlem quite a bit. She was a pretty regular fixture at the Hotel Teresa, which was sort of like the plaza of Harlem. But people were criticizing her books. I mean, Their Eyes Were Watching God is the big one, but her other books as well, because at the time, it was sort of seen that if you were going to be a Black author in America, sort of a luminary of the Harlem Renaissance, that your books should be forwarding the Black cause and should be very overtly political. And hers was not. I would argue that by today's standards, we would see it as a book that absolutely advances the Black cause. But at the time, it was seen as a flimsy love story. This is absolutely not something that gets repeated all the time with female writers, but surely, because the book, for those that don't know, the main character, Janie, it's sort of chronicling 3 different marriages that she has and the trials and travails that she goes through throughout her life, trying to find sort of a true passionate life and a passionate companion. And that's one of the big themes of the book. And people saw that as flimsy and not political enough. Also, she had her characters speak in a very accurate, as I understand it, dialect that is specific to the working class Black population of Eatonville, Florida. But writing in dialect was something that was seen by a lot of her fellow Black writers as pandering to white people. And again, now I think that that's something that's seen as very culturally interesting and appropriate and very poetic, and has sort of a Shakespearean lilt to it because it has a real rhythm to it, and it's really beautiful to read. The book is incredibly beautiful to read. It's very poetic, but at the time, writing in a dialect was sort of like talking. They considered it talking down in a lot of ways.
And it's interesting to me that how much the social economic situations, especially the social movements, can affect what you're almost allowed to do as a writer. When we compare that to somebody like Eugene O'Neill, who captured the dialects of the people who were drinking in the bars and that immigrant community and all those other things, and he wasn't getting that same backlash, and that was even a little bit earlier than this. But it's interesting that when you have that kind of struggle, you're almost trapped in being an honest artist to some degree until you can raise the bar at that level. It's a really interesting point to me, and it reminds me of like James Baldwin and his criticism of Richard Wright with Native Son, I believe, and Baldwin was criticizing that it was two-dimensional. It was just playing into stereotypes, and obviously Wright took offense to it. But it is that it's just another level of the difficulties of being a Black writer in America.
To answer quickly the question that Nicole posited, I can't find, when I was doing research for this, I couldn't find the specific title of the Audre Lorde poem that she got published in 17, but it was supposed to be a tribute to her first love. That is the sort of title that you can use to reference it. It pops up in her biography and places like that.
I did actually have another question on Audre Lorde as well. There's been kind of a rumor in the past that Audre Lorde might have been at the Stonewall Inn during the famous riots. Do we know if that is true? Is there some basis in why that would be thought?
So she was primarily drinking and carousing and being a fun lesbian lady about town in the 1950s. So it's very possible that she went to the Stonewall Inn, but it's not something that's very well documented. And she was not at the Stonewall riots. She was, however, one of the people featured in a pretty amazing documentary that came out in the 80s called Before Stonewall, which was about the queer community in the village and how they existed and survived and drank and caroused before gay pride was really out in the way that it was out once the Stonewall riots happened. And what she had to say about the village at that time was pretty fascinating. And it was a lot of talk about how if you went to a lesbian bar, it was really great because you got to go to a lesbian bar and feel comfortable in your own skin, but also you had to worry about who you talked to because there are undercover policewomen everywhere. So if you didn't know the person, you didn't talk to them, and how, she had trouble as a Black woman. The bouncers would stand outside the door and insist on carding her because you can never tell what age she is with her skin tone and things like that. So she had a lot of fascinating and interesting stuff to say about what it was like to be a gay person in the village before Stonewall, but she was not at the Stonewall riots.
Thanks.
Great, and we just got a question about tipping. So Tom, perfect, Eric, you just got it.
I don't know why I had that handy. It's really crazy.
Perfect. There we go.
Industry collapsed.
You can go to that Venmo link if you'd like to leave tips. It's much appreciated. Thank you all so much. I think that kind of puts us at time. I don't see any other questions in the box, but yeah, I'll turn it back over to you, Eric, closing this out.
And our next tour that we have planned is in April 12th, and we're going to be focusing on poets and poetry in honor of Poetry Month, and so that'll be Monday the 12th. If you are on a mailing list, you'll hear something about that in a week or two. And if you're not, you can join a mailing list and then you can hear about it in a week or two, or you can just surf the web and see if you can find us. And we're trying to get our listings. You're also going to get a follow-up poll. We'd love to get some of your thoughts on either some of the favorite stories or some people you'd be interested in hearing more. And we really encourage any kind of dialogue. You can email us at tours@thebootscrape.com, or if you're old school with us, general@literarypubcrawl.com. But all of this is on our website, literarypubcrawl.com. So and thank you so much. We had a wonderful time. We really appreciate it. Appreciate that so many people hung out. Something I like to end my tours in lately is because often we're asked, like, why do we keep doing it as tours have kind of exploded and everyone's into food tours and there's all the ghost tours and the marketing, and we're talking about writers that no one's ever heard of anymore, and literature is dying and people don't read. I mean, what was the stat that I think maybe 10% of all graduated American adults read a book after high school?
Please don't say that. I have a book coming out and you're going to depress me and scare me.
It is a little depressing.
La 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 la.
and the reason we do it, the reason why I somehow became a literary historian, which was never the career that I thought I would set out on. Career is the wrong word because it sounds like it's an income generating industry, but the passion of becoming a literary historian was thrust upon me. But we forget. We forget who these writers were. We forget that they shaped it. We forget that Zorniel Hurston paved the way for so many of the African-American women writers we're reading now. That some of the rights movements, that some of the cultural everyday experiences we have came from some of these writers and the artists. And we forget who we were as a people, as a nation, as our history. Sometimes we deny our history and we turn a blind eye to the truth of our history. And so for me, literature and the arts, this is how we get back to the truth. And this is how we remember. And I think no better example is a poem that you might recognize, the lines by a New York poetess. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman in the torch, whose flames the imprisoned lightning, and whose name, mother of exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that the Twin Cities frame. Keep, ancient land, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the tired tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. We forget, and I hope for this last hour we helped you remember. Thank you. Toronto!
Thank you, Lucy, for coming on the tour and sticking all the way through. That was so wonderful.
Oh my gosh, I'm giddy. We had a celebrity. A celebrity with a celebrity impersonator, no less.
Yeah, exactly. Alice Walker was a celebrity impersonator of Lucy. I like this. Oh, thanks.
Oh, that's very, very kind. Well, enjoy your weekend. Get through it. Wear your mask, wash your hands. We will get through it. We will see you in person. We are in this together. Thank you very much. And I hope to get to see you in a few weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.